Hi, welcome back. In this part of the tutorial, we are going to show you how you can download Calligraphy locally on your machine. In order for us to do this, you will need to have access to a terminal application, whether on a Mac or on a Windows system, because we are going to be interfacing with GitHub through a terminal application. You will also need to have the Git commands installed in your environment. We will not go through explaining how the Git commands work. So in case you want to know more about this, you can search the Git website, and there is an extensive documentation on how to use these commands on either a Linux, Unix, or a Windows machine in the general sense. We will also not explain how to have a PHP server or a MySQL server throughout these tutorials. We are considering that you already have those servers set up on your machine, and Calligraphy does not need any specific configurations for the PHP server outside the fact that it needs to be version 7 and beyond. And for the MySQL server, it needs to be 5.6 and beyond. So with that being said, the documentation of Calligraphy is quite extensive. So if there's something that is not mentioned in the tutorial itself, you are more than welcome to consult this documentation. The parts we're going to be talking about today are mainly going to be the getting started part, and we will get to a point where we have Calligraphy installed locally, and then in the next video we will learn more about what to do with this framework. So let's go ahead and get started. In order for us to have access to the source code, you can obviously always download the zip file, from Git itself. We don't necessarily recommend that you use it that way, but let's go through a regular cloning mechanism that is done through Git. In order to do that, we will copy the address, the SSH address from GitHub, and then we open a terminal on our machines. In my case, most of the application that I develop are in the document server root. So you need to know your document server root, which you can get from your from the Apache from your Apache server, or from any other PHP server that you're using. In my case, it's in a folder called sites, and this is where I would like to install Calligraphy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter the command for cloning for cloning the code, and in my particular case, I want the code to be installed in a different folder than the one that comes by default from the source code itself. If you look at the source code, it is going to install Calligraphy under a folder called MVC. But since I do have MVC already installed in here, because this is where the source code for Calligraphy is on my local machine, I would like to install it under a different folder name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it posters for the time being, and then we're going to clone that application. And ideally it's done. So now if we go to posters and we do a listing, we can see exactly the same structure that you find in GitHub. All right, so this is done. What we're going to do now is we need to open a code editor, and it could be any code editor of your choice. I am familiar with brackets, and this is what I have in my system, so I will be using brackets, but any other code editor that you're comfortable with, you would be able to use. So I'm going to open brackets, and I'm going to open this new folder that we just created, which is called poster. And let's look at the structure of the files. and how calligraphy is structured. This will help us and will help you understand a little bit how the framework works and what are the main modules and the main concept of the framework, so that if one day you would like to contribute to the code or you would like to make changes to the behavior of the framework, you would know what to target and what files or what classes you would want to use. All right, so in order to do this, of course, there is a README file. There is a bunch of composer files that help define, what the dependencies are. In the first video, we did talk about the different dependencies that are used with the framework, and of course, these dependencies, they keep changing. So probably from the moment the video was done to probably the time you're watching it and you're looking at the GitHub, these dependencies can vary. So at this point of the game, we have 4 or 5, but there is probably by the time and the more this evolves, we might have more dependencies added to the framework. So the composer file is really what's going to determine and describe what your application is, and it's going to help in the packaging of the framework itself. The most important piece in here, other than the description, is really that requirement piece that defines what the dependencies are. So this is what these composer files are doing. Then we have a .ignore, .git ignore. If you are familiar with Git, the git ignore is really meant to determine what files or what folders or what parts of the file structure you want Git to upload or not into GitHub, for instance. So that's what the .ignore is. I will not talk about the dot and dot example yet, because we are going to spend a little more time on it. But I do want to talk about the index.php and the .htaccess. Really, in order for us to understand how routing works in this framework, it's important to understand those two files. It will help us figure out our way around the framework. The .htaccess, what it's doing in the content of the folder of this of calligraphy, is really telling the system and telling the server that every request that is received on the document folder of calligraphy, it needs to be redirected to index.php. So what this is saying is any request that is done through the browser on the posters folder, basically in this particular case, needs to be redirected to index.php, and not only the request, but all the parameters that are associated with the request also are handed off to index.php to handle. So with that, what is index.php really doing in that case that we want everything to go through it? Index.php is really the file that is going to run the framework, and that is going to tell the framework how to handle each and every request that is received, so that the request is not structured based on the file structure itself, so it's not necessarily following a path up to all the way down to reaching a file and reading it the way we traditionally do it, but rather it's gonna take the request and deconstruct it into separate modules that the code can understand. This is exactly how the index.php is going to dispatch the different attributes to different classes of calligraphy that are going to handle the different components of the request. What it does first, it's going to go ahead and load all the dependencies, and the dependencies are usually under a folder called vendor, which should be in the structure but is not, and I will show you how to get those. So it will load all the vendors. Let's start with that, and then what it's going to do, it's going to load all the .env files or variables that we already talked about, I think at some point in the first video. So really what the .m files are all those global variables that are needed by the application, and it's one of the third-party tools that we use to get those .m variables. So what this index.php is going to do, it's going to load all those variables that are defined in the .m file, and then it's going to run the framework, or it's going to run the class called framework. So in order for us to understand this, we will need to dig further into the code. But before we do that, I would like us to start getting all the dependencies. Now notice that the dependencies don't come pre-packaged. Why? Because they take a lot of space and they evolve on their own. They have their own roadmap. So every time you are going to download or clone the code, you will always need to run this command composer install in order to install all the dependencies. And for this to work, you need to have composer installed. And in order for you to install composer, and if you want to learn more about composer, you can find all the resources needed on the composer website. This is a standardized way to package and unpackage any PHP application. So if you are not familiar with Composer, I strongly encourage you to get yourself familiar with it. So by running the Composer install, it's going to install all those dependencies automatically for us, and then the framework would have all the components that it needs to run properly. So it's done. So now if you look at the structure a little bit, you will find over here that there's this new folder that got created that contains all the dependencies that are needed. So if you remember what these dependencies were from our JSON file, so we have PHP, we have PuckPHP, we have GUMP, we have .env, simple image, and stripe, and all of these are in there, along with any other dependencies that they need to function properly. So this is the magic of Composer. It downloads all the packages that you need automatically for you. Going back to index.php, this tells us a little bit that all these vendors now have been auto-loaded, can be used in a very easy way. They can be consumed in our application or in the framework itself. Let's go now and take a look at what's happening with this framework run. What you need to understand is that the core logic of the Caligraphy framework is all under the folder called framework. And what this framework has, or the different components that it has all the classes, okay, that are needed for the framework to work. And among these classes, there's a class called framework that is going to do exactly something similar to what index does, but more proprietary to Caligraphy. So it's going to load everything that the framework needs in order to work properly. It's going to load some core methods that are there out of the box for you to use, and those are global methods that can be used even in the different parts that you are going to create. They are very useful. They would probably help you with a lot of those mechanical methods that are needed, whether they're for string manipulation, session manipulation, or array manipulation. So there is a bunch of those that is very well explained and documented in the Caligraphy documentation. So if you go to the Caligraphy documentation, there is a section called helpers, and if you go to that helper section, it has a listing of all these methods that can be used anywhere across Caligraphy. Going back to the code, it is also, if you notice, using or loading not a class, but a file called initialize. Under that file, those are, if you may, the very initial configuration or settings that are needed for the application to run. Those are mainly Yeah, we can go and take a look at those, but they are mainly session variables that are needed. This is where the PHP session is going to be created, and this is where the session variables that are necessary and that are needed across the application are going to be defined. You will not need to touch any one of those files. I am just mentioning them to you just in case if at some point in the future you would want to change the behavior of the framework, then you would know where the different pieces are. Then there is a set of default settings that is going to be automatically loaded as well as part of loading the framework. Those settings that are configured under the folder settings, they are default. There are default values, and they can be changed. They could very much be changed by you anytime across the application by using some of the methods that are in the core helpers. But in the absence of you changing them, those default values are defined under the core settings. Again, there is no need for you to make any changes to these settings because there is always a method that can help you target these settings and override them whenever you need it. So one thing that this framework is going to do is going to load all these classes or initial classes for you. What it's also going to do is it's going to autoload all the core classes of the framework. Why is this necessary? Because anytime you are using any one of those classes, you no longer need to require them or include them. What autoload does for you, it is going to make these classes available for you to use at any point throughout the different folders or throughout the different structures and different classes that you create, which can become a time saver for you, and it would avoid having you to know the file structure and having to point out to different folders within the file structure. This is what autoload does for us. The last thing that this class is going to do is it's going to hand off the request that comes through index.php. It's going to send it to a routing mechanism. Okay, what the routing mechanism is going to be doing, and we're going to go and take a look at a class called route because this is where all the magic happen. What the routing class is doing, it's going to decompose the request. So it's going to go and fetch the request. It's going to decompose it in a way that it's able to evaluate it into different pieces. And for each and every piece, whenever there are some variables that need to be bound to it, it's going to bind it, and then it's going to send it for execution. Now, all this might seem like jargon to you, but the concept of routing is something that is very important when we're talking about frameworks, because it could help us completely separate the file structure from the way we want to structure our requests. And like this, whenever a user is entering a URI in the browser, that URI is not mirroring the file structure, but it's rather creating a certain logic that is allowing the code, or in this particular case the framework, to understand that URI or that request and to send it to the right controllers and that are dealing with that particular logic. So what does routing look like at the very end of the day? The real routing definition is done under a folder called My Application or Application. It is really this folder where you will be spending most of your time. You will not be changing framework, and you will not be changing most of the other folders in here. The main folder where you are going to be creating the logic, the server logic, and even the client logic is going to be under the application folder. And under this application folder is really where the MVC structure is. So this is where you are going to be creating your controllers, your models, and your views. And we are going to discuss each and every one of those in details throughout the different videos, but they are also very well documented in the Caligraphy documentation. There is another folder in here that is called config, and this is exactly where the routing is. So when you go in there and you go to web.php, this is where you will be defining your routes, and your routes is really what your application understands from the different requests that are being given to it by the browser, which means that this is where you are going to say what requests are acceptable and what requests are not acceptable by your application. And once a request is acceptable, this is where you're going to define what it's going to be doing from the moment it's reached or it's targeted. We will see more how we can do basic routing and some more complex routing in the upcoming videos, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But what you need to understand is, for this framework to work properly, this is how it goes. It goes from the HT access that it's telling all the requests from the browsers to be redirected to index.php. Index.php is auto-loading and initializing all all the global variables that are needed, and it's redirecting to run the framework. The framework is initializing all the variables, all the methods, all the session variables. It is auto-loading all the classes that are needed across the whole framework, and it's asking the route to deal with the request. And when the route is dealing with the request, it is going and it's taking a look at the definition that are defined in here, and this is where it's acting on the requests, and it is deconstructing and decomposing the request in a way that the framework understands it, and based on that decomposition, it is asking to perform certain actions or certain logic, which that logic can either be callback functions or code that is directly in here, or it could be in a separate controller that will handle that logic. We will see all this when we talk more about routing and when we talk more about the different controllers. With that, this would give you an idea and would hopefully have explained well enough what this structure is about for you at least to know when to work with the application and when to work with the framework. There is also other folders in here. So we have the vendor folder that we already talked about. We have the test folder that can be used for any sort of logic testing that you need to do. Then there is this public folder. In this public folder is everything that is happening on the client side. We need to distinguish all the logic that is taking place on the server side from the logic that is happening on the client side. PHP is a server-side language. Most of everything that we're going to be doing in this framework is done on the server. So everything that's done on the server, it's happening under the application folder, and most of these in here, including the views, which are going to be using Pug as a template engine, is actually getting compiled on the server side, and then the result of it is in HTML, which is going to be visible on the client side. So everything that you're going to be doing on the application side is server-side programming. Everything that is happening on the client side, so those are usually languages like JavaScript or any framework for JavaScripting, any images, any assets that you need to load, any CSS that you need to create for your application. If your application for whatever reason does allow uploading files or uploading images, or this is really the area where all of this interfacing with the client is going to happen. It all happens under the public folder. So this summarizes a little bit and hopefully gives you enough information about the file structure. Ideally, at this stage of the game, your code is almost running. The last thing that we need to do and that you need to be aware of is this presence of the global environment variables. Each and every machine or each and every environment where you have this code installed, it needs to have a .env environment. Now, by looking at this, you don't find any .env. In fact, you have something called .env.example, and we are going to replicate this to create our .env file. So what we're going to do is we're going to say copy .env.example and then create a copy of it under a name called .env. Okay, and now under this .env, we're going to go and take a look at it for you to see what can be changed within. So over here, there is an app environment. This is where you're going to determine whether it's a local or a production environment. So what you have locally on your machine is definitely either a local or a dev or anything that you want to call it other than production. But from the moment you decide to move this code into a production server, then you would absolutely need to change this value to production in order for to make that distinction for anything in the framework that is using the app env variable as a way to distinguish local variables from environment from production variables. Every app will have a key. That key is usually encrypted. Of course, just for the sake of the .env.example and for the sake of the video, we are choosing to show a regular string in here, but ideally this should be an encrypted value. The application, and mainly Caligraphy across the board, it uses that key in order to encrypt any information throughout the application, so it's very important to have one, and you need to create an app key for yourself, and it could be any random any random set of characters for as long as it's known by you and saved by you in a private place. The app protocol, so this is usually either an HTTP or an HTTPS at this stage of the game. Most likely, if you are on a local environment, you don't necessarily have SSL. If you have SSL installed and defined in your server, then in that case you might want to go ahead and change this to HTTPS instead. The app debug, when you're on an environment, in a local environment, you probably want to set it to true. Like this, if you have any dependency or any third party that you want to use just for your development environment, then in that case you could use that boolean in order to determine that, and your JSON will understand that to download only those dependencies in the case of an environment that is local. The app root is probably one of the most important thing to change, especially in a case like this one, where I had to download the framework in a different folder, and I did not use the standard folder, but I actually used posters instead. So what I am going to do is I'm going to change that to the posters, and this is going to affect all the redirects that are happening and all the reroutes and the routes. So if you don't have this set up properly, it might cause some unexpected behavior. There's always it's always good to have access to the fav icon. The fav icon, if you don't know what that is, that would be the icon that appears on your tabs up there. So there's always a visual associated to it, and that visual needs to be under the public folder, under images, and anywhere in here in images. In fact, it doesn't necessarily have to be in images for as long as it's in the public folder. App locale and server time zone are all for locale purposes. If you're not familiar with locale is really about the language and the formats and the currency formats and so on that a particular language uses. So in our case, and where I stand, it's English US, but feel free to change this to the locale that is the nearest to you. In terms of time zone, it is exactly the same thing. This is all about the time, about the times. Times are necessary, and they need to be accurate, or as much as possible close to the area where you're at, just to make sure that there are no discrepancies and misunderstandings in the way the server and more precisely in how database times are entered when in your server. So if you want to avoid the discrepancies, it would be good to have a good server time zone. Those are the DB credentials. When we talk more about databases, these will change and will allow us to interface with the database adapter that we're using. Same thing for email. If your application requires emailing, then in that case you need to fill the credentials for the mailing system that is being used. And if your application is an e-commerce app and it requires the use of payment and transactions, then in that case we use Stripe, and those are the credentials for your Stripe payment gateway. So with that said, that covers a little bit what the .env is about. This is something that you might need to change for every instance of environment that you have. For the case of development, we already have it. And then the next time around, in the next videos, we don't need to consult this anymore until we start talking about databases and we start talking about Stripe at some point. With that, I thank you for your time, and I hope that Caligraphy is installed on your computer. We will test out whether or not it's installed in the next video when we start talking about routing. Thank you.